A 5-year-old boy walked to the end of his own driveway to check the mailbox in 1986 and never walked back. No body, no suspect, no answer for 40 years. Until a facial recognition algorithm built for a purpose that had nothing to do with cold cases flagged a photograph on a rural New Mexico ID card that made a retired detective's hands shake. The high desert light in northern New Mexico has a particular clarity to it, the kind that makes distant mesas look close enough to touch and turns ordinary afternoons into something almost cinematic. On the day Lucas Corrigan disappeared, that light was doing exactly what it always did, and nobody in the small town of Alma Vista thought to distrust it. It was late October 1986, a Saturday, the kind of high desert fall day that started cold and warmed fast under a sky with nothing in it to block the sun. The Corrigan family lived on a quiet dirt road outside town, one of a handful of houses spaced far enough apart that a kid riding a bike could cover the whole stretch and know every dog by name. Lucas was 5 years old, the middle child of 3, a serious little boy who loved dinosaurs and insisted on knowing the name of every one, correcting adults who got the pronunciations wrong. His mother, Sandra, worked mornings at the elementary school cafeteria. His father, Miguel, drove a propane delivery route across 3 counties, gone from before dawn most days. Lucas had an older sister, 10, who was supposed to be watching him that afternoon while their mother finished laundry, and a baby brother asleep in the next room. Alma Vista was the kind of town built around a single flashing traffic light, a diner, a gas station, and a church that everyone attended whether or not they were particularly religious about it. It sat at the edge of ranching country, where Hispanic families who'd worked that land for generations lived alongside newer arrivals drawn by cheap acreage and long views. Doors were left unlocked. Kids walked to the end of long driveways alone to check mail, because the road saw maybe 6 cars a day, and everyone recognized every one of them. Trust here wasn't naive. It was built on genuine familiarity, on knowing that the man who ran the gas station had gone to high school with your father, that the woman at the diner counter had held you as a baby. The Corrigan house itself sat back from the road behind a stand of cottonwoods, one of the few patches of real shade for a mile in either direction, planted by Miguel's own father decades earlier. The family kept chickens in a garden that fed half the extended family through the summer, and Saturday mornings followed a rhythm as reliable as the mail truck itself. Chores first, cartoons after. The mail run whenever the truck's dust cloud appeared on the horizon down the long straight road. Lucas had been begging for months to be allowed to walk to the box alone, the way his sister already did. And that particular Saturday was only the 4th or 5th time his mother had said yes. Lucas asked his sister if he could walk to the mailbox at the end of the driveway, a quarter mile from the house, an errand he'd been allowed to do alone for the past several months since he'd turned 5, and their mother decided he was old enough. His sister, distracted by a television show, said yes without really looking up. It was, by every account, an utterly ordinary permission, granted the way it had been granted a dozen times before without incident. He wore a red windbreaker that morning, one Sandra remembers specifically because she'd almost made him change it for something warmer before deciding the day would warm up fine on its own. He never came back with the mail. Sandra realized something was wrong almost an hour later, when she went to check on both children and found her daughter alone in front of the television, mail undelivered. Lucas nowhere in the house or yard. She ran the length of the driveway herself, calling his name into air that carried sound clearly for miles in that kind of open country, and found nothing. No dropped mail, no red windbreakers snagged on a fence post, no sign that anything at all had happened along that quarter mile of dirt road. By the time Miguel got home from his delivery route, 2 hours had passed, and half the neighboring ranch families were already searching, fanning out on foot and horseback across land many of them had known their entire lives. By evening, the county sheriff's department was involved, and by full dark, searchers with flashlights and dogs were combing every arroyo and fence line within 5 miles, working against a landscape that offered 1,000 places for a small child, or evidence of one, to disappear entirely. They found nothing. Not a shoe, not a scrap of clothing, not a single confirmed sighting from any of the handful of vehicles that had passed through Alma Vista that day. The mailbox itself held that day's delivery, undisturbed, exactly where the mail carrier had left it hours earlier, meaning Lucas had vanished before ever reaching it, somewhere along a quarter-mile of open road in broad daylight, without anyone seeing a single thing. Detective Frank Ibarra was 34 years old when he caught the case, a lifelong resident of the county who knew the Corrigan family well enough to grieve alongside them, even as he worked to find their son. He was methodical by training and stubborn by nature, the kind of investigator who returned to a scene 5 times looking for anything the first 4 visits had missed. He organized search grids that expanded daily. He interviewed everyone who had driven that stretch of road, tracked down out-of-town relatives visiting for the weekend, checked every vehicle registered within 20 miles against descriptions gathered from the handful of witnesses who'd seen any traffic at all that afternoon. The leading theory, debated for decades afterward, centered on a beige pickup truck reported by one distant neighbor as having driven slowly past the Corrigan property twice that morning, once before Lucas disappeared, and once after, a detail the neighbor herself wasn't fully confident about until weeks of reflection sharpened the memory. Ibarra chased that truck for years. He cross-referenced vehicle registrations across 3 counties. He followed leads into 2 neighboring states. The truck, and whoever drove it, was never identified, and it became, for Ibarra, the single loose thread he could never stop pulling at. Even decades after the department had officially moved his attention elsewhere, the investigation faced the plain limitations of rural law enforcement in 1986. No national child abduction alert system existed yet. No easy way to circulate Lucas's description beyond regional television and newspaper coverage. No forensic technology capable of extracting information from a scene that had yielded no physical evidence in the first place. Ibarra requested state police assistance within days and received it for 3 weeks before manpower was reassigned elsewhere, a decision that frustrated him for the rest of his career, even as he understood the practical constraints behind it. Sandra's instincts and the department's procedure pulled in different directions almost from the start. She was certain, from the first hour, that someone had taken her son deliberately, that a 5-year-old simply didn't vanish without a trace along a road he'd walked a dozen times before. The department, working from an almost total absence of physical evidence, had to hold multiple possibilities open at once, including the grim likelihood that a body might eventually surface somewhere in the arroyos that laced the county. Ibarra never fully believed that theory himself, but he couldn't rule it out, and the gap between what he believed privately and what he could state officially was its own quiet weight he carried for years. The case went cold within 2 years. Ibarra never stopped working it in whatever margins his caseload allowed, pulling the file every few years to run any name that surfaced through whatever new database the department had acquired. He retired in 2011, having never closed it, handing the file to a younger detective with the same instruction Corbin-like investigators across 100 small counties seemed to give: don't let this one go quiet. The Corrigan family carried the loss the way families carry an absence with no ending. Sandra left her job at the school within a year, unable to be around other people's children with the same ease, and took in sewing work instead, something she could do alone at her kitchen table without having to explain herself to anyone. Miguel kept his delivery route, saying later that the motion of driving, The routine of it was the only thing that kept him functional in those first years. Though Sandra has said he stopped singing along to the radio sometime that first winter and never really started again. Lucas's sister grew into adulthood carrying a guilt she didn't deserve, and everyone around her insisted she release. A guilt that shaped her own decision, decades later, to become a search and rescue volunteer herself, spending weekends combing terrain not unlike the arroyos that had swallowed every trace of her brother. By 1990, 4 years gone, the family had exhausted every private investigator within reach and every avenue the sheriff's department could pursue, including 2 separate psychic consultations that produced nothing but renewed grief and a brief, painful false alarm involving a child's remains, found 2 states away that turned out to belong to someone else entirely. By 1996, a decade gone, Sandra began an annual radio appeal each October on the anniversary, a tradition the local station honored without fail for the next 30 years. Her voice audibly older with each broadcast. By 2001, 15 years, the Corrigans finally held a small memorial gathering at the Cottonwoods behind their house. Not a funeral exactly, since nobody was willing to declare Lucas dead, but a ritual acknowledgement that some kind of marker was needed regardless. By 2006, 20 years, Lucas's case was entered into an expanded national database for long-term missing children, complete with an age progression image showing what he might look like at 25. By 2011, 25 years, Ibarra retired, still without an answer, still convinced the beige pickup truck mattered more than anyone else believed. By 2016, 30 years, Miguel passed away, having spent 3 decades believing his son was gone, but never quite able to stop scanning crowds at gas stations and county fairs for a face that might, impossibly, still match a photograph frozen at age 5. By 2021, 35 years, Sandra finally allowed her daughter to box up Lucas's remaining childhood belongings, keeping only a single dinosaur book he'd loved, the one with the pronunciations he used to correct so seriously. If you've ever driven past a quiet stretch of road and wondered what silence like that can hide for decades, you understand something of what this family lived with for 40 years. Tell us in the comments if a case like this has ever touched your community. We read every one. By 2026, Sandra Corrigan was 78 years old, living with her daughter 2 counties away, having made whatever peace comes only after 4 decades without an answer. That autumn, a state agency processing renewal applications for rural identification cards ran a routine facial recognition audit as part of a fraud prevention upgrade, comparing new photographs against a historical missing persons database that had recently been digitized and cross-linked for the first time. The system flagged a match between an ID photograph submitted that year and an age-progressed image of Lucas Corrigan, generated years earlier for the national database. The confidence score was high enough that a records clerk, rather than dismissing it as algorithmic noise, escalated it to the state police cold case unit out of caution. What followed moved with a speed that startled everyone still connected to the case. The man in the photograph, now 45 years old, lived under the name Daniel Reyes in a small community less than 60 miles from Almo Vista, working as a mechanic, married, with 2 teenage children of his own. When investigators approached him, he was confused by the inquiry in a way that read to the detectives present as entirely genuine. He had no memory of ever being anyone other than Daniel Reyes. No reason to doubt the childhood he'd always understood as his own. DNA testing, arranged carefully and with Sandra's full knowledge before any public confirmation, resolved the question within 3 weeks. Daniel Reyes was Lucas Corrigan. He had been raised, from roughly age 6 onward, by a couple 2 counties over who told him he was their biological son. a story supported by documentation that appeared, on the surface, entirely ordinary. Both of the people who raised him had died, one in 2009, one in 2019, without ever revealing, publicly or privately as far as investigators can determine, how a 5-year-old boy from Alma Vista came to be registered as their child roughly a year after Lucas disappeared. Investigators are now working backward through decades-old paperwork, focused specifically on a gap year in the record that nobody had reason to question until this year, trying to determine who else may have been involved in moving a missing child across 2 counties and into a new identity. The community's reaction, once the story broke, moved through disbelief into something closer to reckoning. People who had grown up with the Corrigan case as a permanent fixture of local memory, a story parents told to explain why certain roads felt different after dark, now had to absorb the fact that the boy in that story had spent 40 years living an ordinary adult life less than an hour's drive away, working on cars, coaching a kid's soccer team, entirely unaware of who he actually was. A former neighbor of the couple who raised him told a local reporter she'd always found it strange that Daniel had no baby photographs anywhere in the house, a detail she'd chalked up to a house fire the family claimed had destroyed old records, a story investigators are now treating with considerable skepticism. Investigators have said the beige pickup truck reported in 1986 remains part of the active inquiry, and that they intend to pursue every available lead toward identifying who was driving it and what role, if any, that person played in the year-long gap between Lucas's disappearance and his documented appearance as Daniel Reyes. No charges have yet been filed. Officials have cautioned that the deaths of both individuals who raised him, combined with 4 decades of elapsed time, may limit what can ultimately be proven, though the investigation remains formally open, and detectives have said they intend to pursue the fire claim and the falsified birth documentation as far as surviving records allow. Sandra Corrigan met her son for the first time in October of 2026, 40 years almost to the week after he walked down that driveway, in a quiet room at the state police offices, with a victim's advocate present for both of them. He did not remember her, could not have remembered the mother he lost at 5 years old, and the two of them have spent the months since slowly building something neither term reunion nor recovery fully captures. A relationship assembled, carefully, from nothing but the fact of shared blood and a willingness, on both sides, to try. Sandra says she brought the dinosaur book to that first meeting, uncertain whether it would mean anything at all, and that Daniel held it for a long moment, without speaking, before finally asking, quietly, whether he'd really once known how to pronounce every name in it correctly. Daniel, he has said he intends to keep the name he's always known, while learning to hold Lucas alongside it, has said publicly that he doesn't experience this as losing 45 years of his life, but as gaining an entire family he never knew existed, a reframing his own children are still working to understand as they meet grandparents, an aunt, and an extended family tree they didn't know they belonged to. His wife has said the adjustment has been its own quiet process, watching her husband absorb an entirely new history at 45 while still being in every practical sense exactly the man she married. Frank Ibarra, 82 years old, said in his only public statement that he always believed that beige truck mattered, and that finding Lucas alive, even decades late, was the first piece of relief he'd allowed himself to feel about this case in 40 years. He said his only remaining wish is to see whoever was responsible for that missing year held to account before his own time runs out. What does it mean to spend 45 years as someone else's son, loved honestly inside a story built on a theft neither of you chose? What do we owe a family that waited 4 decades for an algorithm to notice what 100 human searches could not? And how many more quiet mechanics, teachers, and neighbors are living ordinary lives under names that were never truly theirs, waiting on a match nobody has run yet? Lucas Corrigan is not the boy who walked down that driveway anymore. He's Daniel, a mechanic, a father, a man building a bridge between two names and two families at 45 years old. But somewhere in that bridge, for the first time in 40 years, Sandra Corrigan finally gets to hear her son's real name spoken out loud by him. If this case moved you, subscribe for more cold cases finally solved, and tell us below which detail stayed with you longest. This is a work of fiction. Lucas Corrigan, Frankie Barra, Alma Vista, and all named individuals and locations are invented and do not depict any real person, case, or event.